The smoke remembers. Imagine a night so still you could hear your own breath slow, soft, like it was afraid of making too much noise. It wasn't the kind of silence that comforted you. No. This one pressed down, it had weight. And it came with a smell, one that lingered in the fibers of wool. In your beard, in the timber walls long after the snow melted. Smoke. They say the longhouse breathed in winter, and the breath it let out was smoke. It rose from the fire pit in the center, slow and grey, like an old memory curling upward, searching for a way out through the hole in the roof. Sometimes it found the way. Most days, it didn't. That's how you knew it was real winter, when the smoke stayed inside. You could wave your hand and watch it ripple through the air like water. You could taste it when you swallowed, even when it wasn't mealtime. And if you were quiet enough, you'd hear it settling on the beams, whispering as it clung to hair and fur and wool and breath. In our house, the smoke always remembered. It remembered my sister's cough, my father's boots, the oil in mother's lamp. It remembered the stew that kept burning because the fire was too hot and no one wanted to move to stir it. It remembered the time our goat gave birth in the corner by the doorway, and the baby cried just once, then fell still. It remembered things no one talked about, not because we forgot, but because we didn't need to say them out loud. You learn fast, in a Viking winter, that silence can hold more than words. The longhouse wasn't built for comfort, it was built for survival. One big room, wooden ribs bent upward like the belly of a ship. Packed with people and animals and whatever food we could keep dry. We slept shoulder to shoulder on straw, sometimes next to goats or chickens, sometimes next to people we didn't care for but no one minded. Warmth didn't have enemies. At night, you lay still, wrapped in thick wool, thick air, and thicker thoughts. The fire crackled low, just enough to keep the frost from biting through the thatch. You'd stare up at the rafters, blurred by smoke, and wait. Wait for the morning. Wait for the sound of footsteps or a spoon stirring in a pot. Wait for someone to say, it's still too cold to go out, because it always was. The first winter I remember was the one that took my cousin Eric. He wasn't strong, not sickly, just quiet, always quiet. Slept close to the door because he liked the breeze. Mother warned him. Close means cold, she said. He just nodded and smiled that way he always did. Like he knew something we didn't. He didn't wake up one morning. The strange thing is we didn't cry right away. We sat, we breathed, we let the fire talk first. That's how we mourned back then. That same night, I stared at the smoke and realized something. It doesn't leave you. The cold might, hunger might, even grief. But the smoke, it stays, it clings. It folds itself into the fabric of your skin, into memory. It's not cruel, it's not kind. It's just there. Watching, holding on. Some say the gods watch from the wind. I think they hide in the smoke. If you're listening tonight, maybe you felt that too. Not just the smoke in your lungs, but the kind that lives in old clothes. The kind you smell when you open a box from the attic. The kind that reminds you of someone you don't talk about anymore. If that's you, then this story is for you. Because this isn't a story about glory, not about conquest, or swords, or ships. This is a story about heat. About the little things that keep us alive when the cold wants to take everything else. So pull the blanket closer, let the fire flicker a while longer. A house made of bodies. Some folks think a home is made of wood or stone. But in our part of the world where the wind could strip a man's soul bare, a house wasn't made of walls. It was made of bodies. The longhouse stretched out like a sleeping beast beneath the snow. Narrow, dark. No windows, just timber upon timber, bound together with rope and hope. And inside, us, piled like kindling around the fire, breathing one another's breath, living off one another's warmth. You didn't own space, you borrowed it just like heat. The first time I stepped into the longhouse that winter, I remember the feeling in my chest, like the air didn't want me there. It was warm, but heavy thick with wool grease, smoke, and quiet. You learn quickly. When the snow sets in, everything slows, even sound, even manners. You don't knock, you don't greet, you just find a place. Sometimes that place is beside a man who once scolded your father. Sometimes it's beside a goat with a limp. Sometimes it's in the corner, where you wrap yourself so tightly in furs, you forget where your skin ends and someone else's begins. And somehow, it works. The longhouse had rules, but not the kind you speak aloud. The eldest sit nearest the fire. The youngest, at the far end, curled near animals. No shoes near the bedding. No loud voices after dusk. No moving once people settle. The heat takes hours to gather, and one shiver can undo it all. You learn these not by being told, but by being watched. My mother once slapped my wrist for shifting too much in my sleep. The warmth you lose, she said, isn't just yours. There was a time that winter when we had 17 people and 6 animals in that space. 17 breaths, 17 hopes. 6 animals who did not know patience, but gave us warmth in return. I remember lying between 2 brothers who snored in harmony, and a chicken who pecked my knee every time I moved. Not out of malice, just confusion. The fire didn't reach every corner, but the people did. We didn't call it community. We didn't use fancy words like togetherness. We just were pressed into one another like dried leaves in a heavy book, flattened by the season, maybe, but preserved too. The smoke would drift over us like a blanket. You could watch it hover near the ceiling, unsure if it wanted to stay or leave. It coated the rafters in black, and our lungs with something thicker than dust. It wasn't comfortable, but it was alive. There's something funny about cold. It strips you down, makes everything basic. Breath, skin, food, and people. You stop pretending you don't need each other. You stop pretending you have anything figured out. And slowly, night after night, something changes. A cough becomes a lullaby. A snore becomes a rhythm. And the itch of someone's elbow against your side becomes reassurance. You're still here. They're still breathing. The house still holds. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would lie awake and count the bodies around me. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 17. And when I was sure no one had gone quiet, I could sleep. You don't forget the shape of a winter like that. Years later, even with blankets on your bed and space to stretch, some part of you still sleeps curled, waiting for a stray foot to press against, or a shoulder to lean into. Because once, you lived in a house made not of beams or boards, but of bodies. If you've ever shared a bed too small, if you've ever kept still just to keep someone else warm, then maybe you, too, remember a house like that. Maybe you still carry it in your muscles, in your breath, in the way you lean toward the side of the bed that's already warm. If this story feels like a night you once lived, tell me. I'll hold space for it beside the fire. The weight of wool. Wool has a smell. You wouldn't think so at first. But when you live wrapped in it for 4 straight months, when you breathe it, sweat into it, cry into it, maybe even bleed a little into it, you learn. Wool carries a scent like old stories. Musty, smoky, a little sour, a little sweet. It smells like breath held too long, like firelight trapped in fibers, like survival. Back then, we didn't have closets full of winter coats or heated homes. Our winters weren't something you escaped. They were something you braved. And what stood between us and the cold was wool. Wool was our blanket, our armor, our second skin. It was never new, never soft, never clean. But it worked, scratchy as 1,000 thistles, stiff at the seams, always damp at the edges. Yet when the frost crept through the cracks in the longhouse and laid its fingers on your cheeks, you reached for wool first, not for comfort, but for endurance. In our longhouse, everyone had at least one piece passed down from someone else. My uncle wore a cloak with a dark patch across the shoulder, a patch made from the burial wrap of his own brother. Not out of disrespect, it was the opposite, a way to carry warmth forward, a way to keep the dead part of the living. Wool didn't get buried. It got handed down and worn and reworn and loved. In a quiet, practical kind of way, I had a tunic with sleeves too long for my arms. It dragged through the ashes sometimes when I reached across the hearth. I didn't care. It had once belonged to my cousin, and before that to a woman I never met whose name was sewn in crooked stitches at the hem, Asvigur. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, I'd whisper it. Not like a prayer, more like a thank you. We didn't wash wool in winter. You couldn't risk the wet. A soaked tunic meant frostbite. A damp mitten meant you'd lose fingers. So instead, we'd hang our cloaks near the door, let the wind beat out the worst of it, and rub dry snow into the fibers to lift the grime. It wasn't hygiene, it was tradition. It was survival. I remember one evening late December, when the light barely lasted 6 hours. My mother sat beside the fire, unraveling an old sock. Her fingers moved slow, stiff from the cold. The yarn was frayed and smelled like goat, but she worked quietly, rolling it into a little ball of warmth, waiting to be born again. She didn't say what she was making. She never did. Later that week, I found the yarn again newly knitted into a cap that fit my head perfectly. I wore it every night after that, even when I slept. The thing about wool, real wool, not the kind you find in city shops now, is that it holds memory. You could smell the smoke from last season's fire. You could feel where someone else's elbow had worn a groove. You could hear, if you were quiet, the rustle of laughter woven between the threads. There was one blanket everyone in the longhouse feared and revered. It was dark, almost black, and impossibly heavy, folded 3 times. It still stretched from shoulder to toe. We called it the bear, not because it looked like one, but because it was as warm and as old as the idea of the bear itself. It had once belonged to a woman named Brynja, who delivered 12 children in that same house. She was gone now, bones in the hillside, but the blanket remained. Only the sickest slept under it, only the youngest after a fever. Only those the gods might be watching. One night, I woke with it draped over me. I didn't ask why, I just breathed slower and stayed alive. In modern times, we chase warmth with technology thermostats, heated floors, blankets that hum and glow. But the truth is, real warmth has weight. Wool pulled you down into sleep, not gently, but with purpose. It grounded you, anchored you, made you remember that to be warm is to be held. I've seen folks in the cities toss old sweaters because they itch, because they smell, because they remind them of someone gone. But I kept mine. The tunic, the cap, a mitten missing its match. I keep them in a wooden chest near the fire. Not for wearing anymore, but for remembering. If you've ever run your fingers over a button that no longer closes, if you've ever worn something that still smelled like someone who loved you, then you know, wool remembers what we forget. Do you still have something that once held you close? A coat, a quilt, a name? If so, hold it once more, and let the fire remember it too. The ritual of soup. If you want to know the soul of a longhouse, don't look at the fire, look at the pot that hangs above it. The fire gives warmth, but the soup gives hope. It was always there, always simmering, never boiling, a black iron cauldron, soot-kissed and dented from generations of need. It swung on a rusted hook above the flames, and even when the fire slumped low, the soup whispered. The sound of its soft bubbles, slow sighs was more comforting than any voice. We didn't eat to enjoy, we ate to endure. But the soup gave us more than food. It gave us rhythm, something to mark time when daylight couldn't. Every evening, someone would rise slow, stiff, cautious not to disturb the bedding and shuffle to the fire. There were no grand gestures, no spoken recipes, just a hand reaching for the ladle, then stirring clockwise, always clockwise. If the pot was dry, you added water. If the water was thin, you added bone. If the bone had no meat left to give, you still stirred. Because even empty, the soup was sacred. Some called it ever soup. Others just called it the pot. It was never thrown out, never cleaned, only deepened. With scraps of onion, fat, dried herbs, bark steeped for tannins, maybe a fish head if the river hadn't frozen too thick that week. But somehow, it always tasted like home. I remember one night bitter, wine-dripped, the kind of cold that made your thoughts ache when the soup tasted sweet. Not sugar sweet, not fruit sweet, but warm, rich, like the marrow of something once living had whispered into it. Turned out, someone had added a strip of dried apple, just one saved from summer, hidden in cloth, given without name, and that's how the soup worked. It held secrets. No one said what they gave. No one boasted what they brought. You just offered, silently, reverently. Like prayer, even the poorest found something. A root, a sliver of old cheese, a piece of dried moss that had once fed a goat, and now fed us. The soup made equals of us all. There were children in the longhouse who had never seen the bottom of the pot. It was said the pot had outlived 4 chiefs and 2 houses, that it had travelled from a coastal village in the west, carried on the back of a woman who had buried 3 sons, but kept the flame alive in her ladle. She never spoke of them, but she always stirred twice, once for her boys, and once for whoever might be hungry. When a man died in the winter, his bowl stayed in the same spot for 7 days. We didn't fill it, we didn't touch it, just let the steam rise past it, as if the spirit still waited for a taste. Some folks thought it was superstition, but to us, it was remembrance. I had my own bowl, a simple thing, carved by hand, smooth from years of lips and steam. I kept it tucked in the folds of my wool, near my hip. The rim was chipped, the base cracked once and sealed with pitch, but it held. It always held. You learn, after enough winters, that soup isn't just food, it's memory, it's mercy. There were nights when hunger made us angry, when the scraping of the ladle on the bottom of the pot felt like betrayal, but no one spoke it. We just passed the bowl, swallowed slow, and listened to the fire breathe. 1 sip. 2, let it rest, then pass it on. In spring, when the snow finally cracked and light returned, we never stopped the pot. We just let it cool for a day, gave thanks, then lit the fire again. Because winter always comes back, and the soup is what keeps the story warm. If you've ever tasted something that made you remember someone, if you've ever felt full not in the stomach, but in the soul, then you know what I mean. Have you ever made a meal that held more than flavor? A stew, a tea, a biscuit your grandmother taught you? If so, tell me. Let's stir the story back into the pot. Sleeping with animals. You might find it strange now, sleeping beside a cow, waking up with a chicken on your chest, sharing your dreams with a goat whose breath smells like wet bark and worry. But in our winters, animals were not separate. They were survival. The longhouse was not divided into rooms. No privacy, no quiet corners, no space for shame. We lived, arty, slept, argued, and mourned in one long breath of a space. And that breath carried the scent of animals. Our cows lay nearest the back wall, bigger than us, warmer than the fire, slower to startle. Their sides rose and fell like ships at sea, and at night, their breath fogged the rafters with a gentleness you didn't expect from such bulk. When the wind howled hardest, the cattle would press their backs into the wood beams. That pressure alone kept the walls from buckling. They didn't know it, but they held the house like we held on to hope. Goats roamed freer, curious, nosy, endlessly chewing something, even when nothing was left to chew. I woke once with one nibbling the fringe of my cloak. Another time, it curled against my leg like a child, its heartbeat quick and steady through the wall. Some of them had names, others earned nicknames based on mood. Grumpy, One Eye, the Tripper. None were pets, but none were strangers either. Chickens. Now they made the rules. They roosted where they pleased, behind barrels, under benches, sometimes directly on someone's lap if they sat still too long. At first, their clucks annoyed me. They interrupted dreams, stirred the silence, but in the heart of winter, any sound that wasn't the wind felt like mercy. There was one sheep, a small ewe named Cora, who always found her way into the sleeping pile near the children. No one trained her. She simply chose. Her wool held the scent of ash and old grass. Her eyes blinked slow, as if she remembered too much. And when my sister cried in her sleep, Cora would bleat once, soft, and lean in closer, like she understood. We didn't separate man from beast. We couldn't afford to. Their body heat kept ours alive. Our hands kept their hearts beating. It was a pact older than any god we whispered to before bed. You learn to sleep with the sounds, the heavy breath of cattle, the startled rustle of feathers, the distant scraping of hooves on wood, the quiet, unmistakable crunch of straw beneath shifting weight. Some nights, you slept so close to a creature, you dreamed its dreams. You'd wake with hay in your mouth, or your back arched like a hoofed thing, but you never minded because they were warm, and warmth was worth any indignity. We even made room for the dog, old, blind in one eye, smelled like fish guts and frostbite. But he knew how to curl around the feet of the eldest tucked in like a prayer. Silent and sure, he barked once that whole winter, just once. It was the night the snow collapsed the barn roof. We listened, we dug, we saved what we could. Some folks say dogs don't understand things. I say they remember what matters most. When spring came, We led the animals back outside. They blinked at the sky like it owed them something. Some kicked the snow, others wandered into fields they hadn't touched in months, but most stayed close to the house, as if reluctant to let go of the strange season where they and the humans breathed the same thick, smoky air. I missed them that first night they slept outside. Missed the snorts, the rustle, the living heat pressed against my spine. The longhouse suddenly felt hollow. Years later, when I lay in soft beds beneath fine quilts, I still found myself drifting toward the edge, searching for the shape of something living beside me, a reminder that survival never came alone. If you've ever slept with a cat curled by your ribs, if you've ever cried into a dog's fur and felt safer for it, then you understand, because warmth doesn't only come from fire. It comes from nearness, from rhythm, from the humble breath of a creature who asks nothing of you, except maybe your stillness. Time without clocks, before the world ticked, before minutes were boxed into rectangles on paper, before the day got sliced thin by little glass screens. We had light, just light. It came in soft, angled low through the chinks in the wall, barely touched the floor most days. But when it did, we noticed, not because it meant something was scheduled, but because it meant we were still here to see it. Inside the longhouse, light didn't pour in, it crept. The slats in the timber let in ribbons of day, narrow and golden like threads from an old woman's needle. In winter, those threads grew shorter, colder, more hesitant. Some days, they didn't come at all. And when that happened, time stopped meaning anything at all. But we still knew how to tell it. We told it by the way steam rose from the soup, by how much wood was left stacked near the hearth, by the itch in your wool and the ache in your knees, by the sound of the goats growing restless in the dark, by the weight of the cold in your chest when you first sat up. Time was never told with numbers. It was told with knowing. There was an old man in our house named was Lofter, who claimed he could hear the hour in the fire crackle. We'd laugh, but secretly we believed him. He'd say things like, "That's a noonday snap," or "Hear that slow sizzle. That's a dusk burn." And then he'd nod off mid-sentence, as if the fire had whispered a lullaby only he could understand. Children measured time in stories. "Tell me one until the goat shifts," my little sister would say. "Tell me one until the wood hisses." And sometimes we'd tell the same story 3, 4 times, not because we forgot the ending, but because we weren't ready to let the moment slip into the next. There were no clocks, but there was rhythm. We had a rope near the fire marked with simple knots. Each knot was a meal, each loop was a prayer. When the knots ran low, we knew the month had passed. Or maybe just that the hunger had grown bold enough to ask for more than we had. Still, someone would tie another knot, not to fool time, but to say, "We're not done yet." And the smoke, the smoke was our sundial. In the morning, it rose fast, like a young boy running. At midday, it settled low, hovering near the beams. At dusk, it drifted side to side, slow and tired, like an old woman pacing before bed. We followed it with our eyes, not to track minutes, but to feel the shape of the day unfolding. One woman used to press her hand on the wall beam and say, "It's past midday, the warmth is gone." She didn't mean the sun, she meant the hope, but she still stirred the soup anyway. Night didn't arrive with darkness. It arrived when the last person stopped humming. Sometimes we didn't speak at all, just listened to breath, to fire, to time passing not with bells, but with the soft collapse of thought. And sleep came not with a pillow, but with the weight of having made it one more turn of the sun. No alarm, just a sigh, a deeper exhale than the one before, a settling of shoulders against straw, a loosening of the grip on whatever story you were holding on to. In that world, time wasn't something to chase, it was something to sit beside, to nod toward, to let pass like a friend on the road neither hurried nor held. Even now, all these years later, I sometimes find myself watching the light touch the floor in a quiet room, and I think, maybe time hasn't changed at all. We have. If you've ever looked out a window and known the hour by how the light hits your coffee cup, if you've ever stayed in bed, not because you had nowhere to go, but because the morning hadn't asked you to move yet, then you, too, remember time the way we did. The hearth's quiet rule. No one taught us the rules of the hearth. They weren't inscribed in wood, nor carved in stone. These rules lived in silence. When you enter a longhouse, you learn without being told what matters most. Don't touch the pot rim. Don't walk between someone and the glow. Don't take more than your share of wood from the pile. The hearth sits at the heart of everything. It's not just fire, it's promise. That tomorrow will come, that frost will ease, that breath will return, world by world. When the fire burns at its quietest, just embers, you feel its presence more than its heat. Its red glow hums against the stones. Its warmth seeps down into your bones. You learn to move around it like a dance. In that dim light, my father would sit, leaning forward, not speaking, yet listening. I'd pass him a stick. Without looking up, he'd tap it on the woodpile twice. One for the fire, one for his daughter. And I'd add it, because that's how you fed the hearth's authority. But I remember the night I broke its rule. It was late. I tiptoed near the fire pit with a small bundle of kindling. Wanted to please, but I leaned too close. A spark flew, hit the thatched beam. For a moment, I froze. The fire hissed. The timber flinched. No one spoke. No one rushed. The fire grew calm again on its own, quietly sipping the new wood. Then my father put his hand on my shoulder. No words. That was all I needed. You learn fast in winter. The hearth watches as much as it warms. The hearth has hierarchy, closest elders, storytellers, those who know the long night. Next, those who learn from them. Further back, those who wait, watch, breathe. At each level, there would be shared breaths and shared meals. Silence meant thought. Movement meant respect. At times, I saw strangers hesitate at the door, their eyes flicking toward the glow. They'd bow slightly, step in slow, and find a place on the side. Never bold, never loud. They came for warmth. Yes, but more for the quiet belonging. And belonging is the true fuel of the hearth. During the long nights, when hunger and cold pressed in, the hearth held us together. It wasn't the fire pit's heat. It was the shared space it carved. We passed bread loaves in half. We passed knives without words. We passed stories soft and sure. Some nights, a lullaby would rise. A woman, maybe my mother, or maybe an aunt, would hum the tune of summer. It was the same melody every winter. Not loud, but steady. It said, "We're here." We remember warm grass. We waited. In those notes, the hearth had rules. Keep it burning. Keep it shared. Keep it quiet when needed. And feed it with trust. Science tells you fire needs oxygen, fuel, and heat. But that fire needed more. Boundaries. It couldn't burn forever. It needed rest. It needed attention. It needed respect. We took watch in shifts. A nod. A stirred ember. A prompt to feed logs. Because the hearth, like a heartbeat, must never stop. If it falters, so do we. When someone had lost their way, lost their voice, the hearth would hold them. They'd sit closest to the glow. Their eyes, lit by embers, would reflect the house. Others would drift close, rose-bead eyes, ripe with unspoken care. No gentle questions, just presence. Presence was the hearth's gift. I learned to read the hearth like I read faces. When the flames rose bright, hope was in our meals. When they dimmed, we whispered memories. And when coals glowed red, we slept safe. One evening, when a traveller passed through with a tattered cloak, he asked to sit. He didn't speak. He couldn't have known the unwritten law. So he placed his cloak by the fire, folded it neatly, and sat. My mother nodded, passed him a spoon, and he stirred the soup clockwise just once. We all exhaled. That's how you know someone understands the hearth. Years later, when I lit my own hearth in a small cabin back home, stone, brick, hearth framed perfectly in the center, I felt the weight of those rules. I fed it with the same quiet care. I never let the embers rest cold. And when guests came, I did not speak until the hearth spoke, because warmth isn't just heat. It's ceremony. It's invitation. It's the promise of another shared breath. If you ever sat by a fire, felt its glow, and knew words didn't matter, then you felt the hearth's quiet rule, the smoke that stayed. Smoke doesn't just rise. It clings to wool, to rafters, to hair braided tight, to lungs that have learned not to flinch. Long after the fire has gone cold, the smoke stays. You can smell it in your sleeves, feel it in your eyelids. Taste it on the back of your tongue, even when no fire burns nearby. In the longhouse, smoke was a language. It told us how strong the wind was outside, how green the wood was, how soon we'd run out of birch bark for kindling. It hovered near the ceiling, like a soft ghost, never angry, just stubborn. You learned early, don't chase it away. Let it sit, let it settle, let it season the wood, the skin, the soul. Because a house that smelled of smoke was a house that lived. There were mornings when it lay thick as soup. We'd wave our hands slowly, not to clear it, but to make space for breath. We didn't complain. We adjusted, kept the door cracked, bent lower when we walked. You could find children crouched near the floor like cats not playing, just breathing easier. My grandmother had a saying, if you can't see the beam, it's a stew day, which meant stay inside, boil everything, stir twice. And so we did. Smoke got in your bones. Literally, some would say, the old folks had coughs that came with winter and left with the thaw. They didn't fight it, they named it. The house rattle, the embers whisper, my grandfather's breath. At night, when the fire was low and we all lay curled in our wool and straw, you could still see the smoke rise faintly, like dreams leaving the body. It made halos in the rafters. It carried stories higher than voices could reach. There was a boy once, Anna, who drew faces in the soot that gathered on the inside beams. Quiet boy. Rarely spoke, but his fingers said plenty. One day he drew a deer so lifelike it startled the goats. Next week, it was a ship. Week after that, a sleeping woman with her mouth open and a strand of hair caught in her lips. When spring came, the soot wore off, and so did Arnie. He vanished, like the smoke that once held his art. We remembered him in the way the beams still looked soft to the eye, as if his drawings had changed the wood itself. Sometimes the smoke burned your eyes. Sometimes it found a tear and slipped inside, like salt. But other times, it felt like a second skin, a reminder you were still inside something warm, still part of something shared. You didn't just breathe smoke, you became it. Years later, in the city, I met a man who told me, "You smell like chimney soot." I smiled. He meant it as insult, but to me it was proof I came from something ancient, something that hadn't forgotten how to burn slowly. Modern fires burn too clean, too fast, too quiet. They don't linger. They don't teach patience. They don't stay in your coat for 6 days. But the smoke we knew, it was loyal. It clung even after you left the house. Other longhouses could smell your fire and know where you came from. It was a scent map, a signature, a way of saying, we're here, we're still burning. Sometimes I wonder what memories the smoke carried. Did it hold our laughter in its curls? Did it remember the way my father sang off key while splitting logs? Did it carry my sister's first words higher than we ever could? Maybe the gods didn't need prayers. Maybe they just needed smoke. Because what is smoke, if not breath made visible? If you've ever opened a box of old clothes and felt your chest catch, if you've ever smelled your mother in a scarf she hasn't worn in 20 years, then you know smoke doesn't leave. It waits, the language of hands. When a longhouse falls silent, you might think darkness has claimed it. But you'd be wrong, because in the quiet corners, laughter still lives. It floats through the haze of smoke, drifts above embers that glimmer in the night, and seeps into every crevice of timber and straw, reminding us that life, even in its harshest moments, can still remind us how to smile. In the deepest part of winter, when snow piled against the walls higher than a man's waist, when daylight was a rumor, and when the cold felt as though it might hollow you from the inside, something remarkable happened. We would laugh. It wasn't the loud, uncontrolled laughter of freedom or joy. It was a soft release, a warm ripple that passed through lungs stiff with smoke and cold and worry. It wound between bodies and settled in shoulders that had forgotten how to feel light. I remember the night my cousin Finn tripped over a sleeping goat while trying to slide across the floor in woolen socks, his arms flailing like branches in a gale, and then slamming against a barrel, knocking it over so that a dozen dried apples scattered like golden raindrops across the hay. No one said anything. At first, everyone froze, as though we didn't know how to register that moment. Then my sister let out a small giggle that turned into a gentle cough, which then became a full-fledged laugh, and soon the entire house was filled with warm, hushed echoes of amusement that rolled through the walls like a wave. That sound broke something. It dissolved the tension of the night. It reminded calm people that they could still feel surprise, and sad people that they could still feel kindness. We have a saying, though few knew it until later: laughter is the ember that survives the smoke. Because once you laugh, even on the coldest night, warmth will come again. Another time, after a long silence filled with the gentle burrowing of goats, someone began telling the story of Jari the fisherman, a man who once tried to dry fish by the fire, but ended up tossing them all into the pot because his wife refused to let him cook indoors, fearing that the smoke and steam would chase the gods away. He mimed the fish flailing, the steam rising to kiss the rafters, and the look of resignation on his own face. In the hush after the punchline, he smiled, raising one eyebrow in triumph. And the house erupted not with raucous peals, but with that soft collective breath of release. It was a different kind of performance, not meant for crowds, nor for records, just for warmth. Our laughter wasn't about event, it was about connection. It was the thread woven through the cold, pulling us together when the darkness tried to drive us apart. You felt it in the chest, just behind the sternum, that place where ribs meet a heart in need of beating faster for a moment. It didn't last long, maybe a few beats, maybe 30 seconds, but that was enough. You didn't have to speak. You didn't have to explain why you were smiling. You just had to let it out. And in that exhalation, you breathed. Science tells us that laughter releases endorphins, that harmless chemicals drift through your bloodstream and remind you that you're alive. I think it does more. Laughter becomes a living thing, a spark that lives in the longhouse long after the moment passes, like embers glowing in the ashes, waiting to flicker to life again. We laughed with our lips closed, to keep the smoke from tasting bitter. We laughed with our hands on our knees, eyes on each other, and hearts yours, quickening mind following. We laughed with the awareness that if the wind changed direction, it would carry our secrets out into the night. But we never cared, because by then, the warmth of the sound had already reached our bones. Children learned to mimic it. They would hide behind barrels and peer out, flipping their fingers at the wall in perfect imitations of their fathers, puffing their cheeks to make the sound of the goats grumble, and holding their breath until the whole house dissolved in quiet, mirthful breathing. Elders laughed too slow and soft, like warming coals responding to fresh wood. And in that sound there was timelessness, a reminder of all winters past, of town halls and weddings lost to time, of the seasons that always arrived afterward. Some nights, we laughed simply because someone dared to say the word lazy bones, and someone else would respond by calling them barn door brain, and another would reply with frozen beard fool, and before you knew it, we were trading invented insults that no one really meant, and each one pushed the next deeper until hearts opened in spite of the cold. By the end of winter, we had a lexicon of laughter sounds that said we survived and we still had each other. When the snow finally quit falling and light stretched into the evening, that laughter changed again. It slowed down, it softened, but it didn't leave. It followed us outside as we slung open the doors and gasped for air, and we carried that ember into spring, lighting new fires, new pots, new days. But somewhere, in the heart of the longhouse, under the soot-dark rafters, the hush remained, a hush that now contained the echo of warmth, not the absence of it. If, tonight, you've ever smiled at something small, if you've ever felt your heart lighten because of a joke you whispered to someone beside you, then you've heard laughter in the smoke, and it's still alive, seeing light in the dark. Darkness in the longhouse was not merely the absence of light, it was a presence in itself, a heavy, tactile thing that pressed against the walls and settled in the hollows of our bones. It was a thick veil that wrapped around every person, every bale of straw, every animal that shared our space. But in that darkness, we learned how to see differently. When the fire dwindled to embers and the sun retreated beyond horizon's grasp, our eyes, blurred by cold and smoke, began an unspoken adjustment. We stopped looking outward for illumination and started looking inward, to the flicker of embers, to the faint shine of wool threads, to the pale reflection in someone's eyes. We learned that light didn't need to be bright. Sometimes it just needed to be gentle enough not to break us. On one of the longest nights, when the wind howled against the door, as though it wanted to shred the boards and drag the longhouse into the dark. The glow inside wasn't enough to fill the room. Yet, as I sat by the hearth with a tin oil lamp made from seal fat, the feeble flame shining in my hand, I noticed that its little halo of light seemed to swell when I cupped my chest around it, as if it responded to my heartbeat and my awareness that we were still here, still alive. I walked slowly toward the sleeping corners, passing bodies that rose and fell in dreams, and placed the lamp on a rough wooden stool beside my younger sibling. The wick trembled against the glass cylinder, and as I leaned forward, I could see the child's face relax, the eyelids shift, and the blanket rise in a tiny sigh, a subtle acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, remembered they were there. Light, in that world, became a gesture rather than a thing, a nod when someone stirred near the doorway, a flick of the ember to show that meal was ready, a pointed glance toward the wall where lice clung to the wood, a reminder that the world beyond the fire had its own inhabitants waiting patiently for spring's arrival. I remember another night when I was entrusted with lighting the corridor lantern. The small pot of pitch-doused rope hung by the door, meant to guide visitors late in the night. My hand shook from cold and responsibility as I held the flame to the wick. And as the lantern came to life, its glow spilled into the hallway, illuminating the faces of two travelers who had arrived unnoticed. Their eyes, red-rimmed and weary, softened when they realized they were seen, and they exhaled as if burdened weights had been lifted. In that moment, the light wasn't just a guide, it was a greeting, a welcome, a signal that darkness did not mean abandonment. Over time, we began to speak in light. A brighter spark meant warmth, a softer glow meant caution, silence accompanied by ember meant reverence. One evening, after passing a particularly cold day filled with failed wood gathering and broken hopes, the chief lit a second candle on the table by leaning into the flame and letting its light dance across his lined features. We didn't comment. We only watched as the candlelight etched warmth back into his face, as though the flame itself whispered that tomorrow might hold more. We learned how to share light without words. If someone's lamp was low, the neighbor would lean in and breathe on the wick gently, but not blow. So the flame would catch again. It was a gesture of trust, a gesture of care. If someone's hand shook while trying to relight a lantern, another hand would steady the container, not because the offer was seen or named, but because it was understood. These small exchanges built an ecosystem of illumination, one where light and darkness lived in balance, guided by empathy and shared breath. There was a night I will never forget, a night when we ran out of seal oil and the lamps went dark almost all at once. A hush fell that was thicker than any winter night. No fire, no lamp, nothing but the scent of cold and the metallic taste of fear. We sat in blackness, until some soft-spoken, tentative someone tapped the side of the lamp and whispered, "We still have ember." And so we lit the lamp from a single coal glowing in the hearth, one by one tracing the circle of faces, reaffirming that light still lived in our midst. In that act, each of us carried the flame forward, because it was a symbol that together we could still create light no matter how small. Science tells us that humans are wired to notice light even in the faintest appearance, that our pupils widen, our perception sharpens, and our brain rewards us with the quiet satisfaction of survival. But in the longhouse, the slow reintroduction of light each night into darkness that seemed endless felt like a collective survival ritual. It wasn't biology alone, it was belief. It was ceremony. It was proof that we belonged to each other. I've since learned to apply that lesson anywhere. If I enter a dim room, I greet it with a switch. Yes, but also with a moment where I acknowledge that darkness has been there before me, that the place existed without me. And when the bulb clicks on, I think of those faces in the longhouse, the traveler's relief, the child's deep breath, and I smile. Because seeing light in the dark isn't just about illumination. It's about recognition, about presence, and about remembering that even soft things matter. If tonight you find yourself in a dark corner alone but not forgotten, light a candle. Don't do it to chase the dark. Do it to honor the faces that came before and to promise to the ones beside you that, yes, we are still here. Music of the bones. In the longhouse, the truest music wasn't played on instruments, not in the way most people imagine, but emerged from the rhythms of our bones and breath working in quiet harmony. A kind of natural chorus that rose in those long, dark winters when silence could feel like it would swallow you whole if it wasn't gently broken. Every movement had a note. The scraping of a knife on bone as someone prepared dinner had its own tone. The steady munching of an animal by your side offered a comforting beat. The creak of the wooden floorboards underfoot. The shuffle of wool-draped bodies shifting in the night. These became part of the house's song, carried in the air like smoke through rafters. One evening, when the wind outside had been howling for hours and the fire sputtered low enough to need almost constant feeding, my Uncle Henrik began to hum a low, soft melody born from an old tale of sea voyages. Faraway lands under midnight sun. It wasn't loud, but the notes wedged themselves between the smoke-thick air and settled in people's chests. The hush grew thick, respectful, expectant, and soon a sister joined in, matching tone, turning the tune gently, an octave higher, so it drifted across the house like a soft cloud. My father tapped a silent rhythm against the side of a wooden bowl, and that became the percussion. A goat nestled against someone's knee lifted its head and grunted, as if joining the chorus. The rest of us, still feeding the fire in turns or tearing bits of bread, did so to the undulating melody that wasn't just music, it was survival. I remember the moment when I realized that music didn't need instruments. It needed breath and presence. I had been watching my sister's hand as it moved through the air, fingers grasping at invisible tunes. When I joined her with 2 stones, tapping them together softly, rhythmically, it felt like I touched something deep in the earth. A primal beat that spoke of hearth, heart, and home all at once. It was a melody we all already carried. As the song grew, other sounds entered. A child began a slow drum beat, banging a spoon against a wooden plate. Another said a soft word between lines, like a verse, for winter's turn, and everyone acknowledged it with a nod. None of us spoke out loud, we didn't need to. The music didn't ask for lyrics. It asked for presence, unity, warmth. The goat shifted, a board creaked, the lamp flame twisted. All became part of the tune. And in that moment, you heard each other, not with words, but with your skin and breath and bones. We learned that strength isn't always loud, but silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes, it means something else is listening or singing beneath it. The oldest woman in our longhouse, Frida, taught me that. She tapped her walking staff twice on the floor, slower than me, but with purpose. When she did, the house folded into itself. Attentive, waiting, she hummed a single note, clear and unwavering, and the rest of the melody held its breath around it. It reminded me that even the faintest whisper can shape a song if spoken with intention. Sometimes, the music fell into a pause so deep we could feel the world hold its breath with us. That was our cue to end the unspoken signal that this was enough for tonight. A final tap of spoon, a whispered verse, and then quiet, gentle. Safe quiet, with embers glowing low and the scent of smoke and wool, and unspoken stories lingering in the air. But the music never truly left us. It stayed in our bones. Years later, when I boarded a train in a city full of noise and hurry, I closed my eyes and listened. The hum of the tracks became a steady drum. The shutter of doors was a cymbal's clang. People's footsteps tuned themselves into a rhythm you could only hear if you slowed down. I pressed my hand to my chest and felt the beat there. The echo of that longhouse, of that night where silence wasn't absence, but invitation to listen more closely. Science would call it entrainment, people synchronizing with external rhythms, hearts beating in unison with sound. But to me, it was more than biology. It was ancestral memory, a melody carried in the marrow, passed down through breaths in the dark. In my own home now, when I sit by my modern hearth with its clean lines and invisible flames, I hum the old tune softly, so my partner doesn't think I've gone mad. Sometimes we tap spoons, sometimes we say, "For winter's turn," and the echoes fill the room with warmth that vibration alone couldn't bring. I realized we never played music to escape winter. We played it to remember summer, to remind our lungs that they were meant to sing, and our hearts that they were meant to beat together. If you've ever tapped your thigh to a rhythm only you can hear, or hummed a song in your mind to fill an empty room, then you know the music beneath the silence, the bones that sing when everything else is still, carrying spring inside. Even when the landscape outside was frozen solid, with snow piled in crystalline drifts that gleamed like shards of glass under a pale midday sun, and the wind that brushed past the longhouse walls carried a biting chill that could settle under your skin and make your bones ache in protest. There was something deeper at work in our hearts, a quiet conviction that spring was not somewhere out there, waiting for the thaw, but already living within us, beating like a shy heartbeat in the warmth of our shared breath. It began with small signs inside the house, a flicker of memory, a scent, a tone which we carried carefully, almost reverently, as though we were cradling the first fragile buds of a plant we dared not admit was real yet. One morning, after a night when the fire had burned lower than usual because the wood pile was nearly empty, my mother placed a tiny bowl by the hearth containing a sprig of forsythia, picked from a sheltered grove near the riverbank before the frost reached its yellow edges. She placed it so gently, almost as if it might shatter, and as its bright bloom hovered in the smoky air, someone whispered, "Spring is coming." It wasn't true. Of course not outside. That night, the moon froze in a sky unbroken by clouds, and our footsteps on the snow made sharp echoes. But inside that longhouse, the sight of yellow light and bloom made us breathe deeper, believe harder, prepare our dreams for warmth. We began carrying spring inside us in small ways. In the hush of the hearth at dawn, we spoke of thawing soil rather than icicles. We hummed old harvest songs while stirring soup. We braided strands of dried wildflowers, pressing them between pages of a book of poetry we'd made for winter's memory. We even began to notice how the young goat's fur was shaggy not just with cold, but caught between winter and spring, as though their coats, like ours, waited for soft days. Food changed, too not in taste, but in tone. The heavy root stews, born of necessity, began being punctuated with wild greens we tucked into the heat while no one watched. Dried leaves that smelled like promise, mossy bits we rinsed and added to broth tiny, green sparks against the muted palate of winter. Each bite reminded us that tongues could remember warmth even if tongues themselves were numb. Even chores took on new meaning when the snow became brittle beneath our boots. Instead of dragging wood further into the night, we paused at the threshold of the barn and listened for the swell of wings or the quiet scurry of vermin lit by eyes that believed they, too, could survive. We felt spring inside in the way we hurried the goats out into the bright, a little too eagerly, and watched them shake off the dust of winter in small, hopeful shivers. We washed moss from water troughs as though scrubbing a path for our own thawing, and words shifted. A greeting became May. You feel the first thaw tomorrow. A thank you became, you've carried sunshine here. Even curses bore a lightness. May your snow melt when sun stands high. They were not empty wishes, they were shared belief. More than once I found myself inside a crackling firelight, listening to my father recount a memory of planting barley long ago, when he was still a boy, free of worry, his hands warm in the soil and sunlight at his back. He spoke not just of seeds, but of laughter rising over the field, of wind threading through barley like a sea, of hope so abundant it spilled from his chest like wine. And for a moment, the longhouse felt warmer. My mother's fingers rose to his hand, their years showing there but meaningless compared to the warmth between them. That night, as the fire died to glow and the crickets outside sang their thin spring song, we placed the forsythia bowl in the center of a ring formed by hearthstones. We sat around it old and young, tired and hopeful, our faces lit by its yellow. The fragrance so faint only the closest noses caught it. We breathed spells into it. No words needed, only shared rhythm. Exhale, inhale, believe. And in that circle, I felt the turning. I felt our hearts aligning with a season that had not yet arrived outside, but lived in our chests already. Science calls this anticipatory optimism. Humans preparing their minds before events happen, tricking the brain into release of dopamine and calm. Yet to us, it was far more ancient, more sacred. It was faith formed from bone and breath, ritual anyone could share, even without knowing it, woven into winter because it made the season bearable enough to survive. One morning before dawn, I woke to faint light in the east paint the sky in pale pink. I slipped outside, the snow beneath me soft and unfamiliar, and I saw footprints from the barn animals, sheep and goats gathering under an arch, where the fence bent heavy with snow. In that hush, I carried spring not just in heart, but in footstep. I traced the prints past the barn, past the trees, until the edge of the field where the snow thinned and patches of earth bled dark. And there I saw the first crocus, a single violet bloom pushing through hard white. I brought it inside, cupping it beside the yellow sprig. When the house woke, we saw not snow but two small flags of colour in the haze. I stood back and watched the youngest child exhale a breath that looked like a sigh of relief. And I realised that spring wasn't arriving. We were carrying it, always had. In time, snow melted, earth exhaled, fields sighed. We planted seeds in darkness but under careful watch, believing that hope would root before frost. And it did. If you've ever carried a secret bloom in your pocket when the world still felt frozen, if you've ever believed warmth before it touched your skin, then you know what it means to carry spring inside, a cradle for dreams. There is a magic in winter nights that few understand until they feel it. The longhouse becomes more than shelter. It becomes a cradle for dreams, a vessel woven from straw, smoke, timber, and the collective breath of its occupants, each exhalation carrying our wishes, fears, hopes, and memories into that living, breathing space, turning it into something both fragile and profoundly enduring. I remember the night when the first sprig of crocus lay beside the hearth. And though the world beyond those wooden walls still lay blanketed in snow, inside the house, something whispered of tomorrow, and we understood that dreams could not lie dormant just because the earth did. So we began to shape ours, not with words but with gestures, with small acts that carried meaning. A child tracing runes in the soot of the hearth stones, hoping for courage. A woman pressing her palm into a bowl of grain, wishing for enough food. My father carving a small wooden ship, his first practice for a vessel he hoped one day to build in spring's thaw. These dreams mingled with the smoke soft, unspoken, but alive. They rose into the rafters and floated above our heads while we slept, like silent prayers, breathing promise into the gathering darkness. And when dawn came, often startling in its brightness, after long grey stretches it found dreamers, still resting, but stirring, as though even sleep had urged them forward, prepared them for the day to come. Inside the longhouse, the boundaries between night and morning blurred. You could awaken in darkness, your body heavy with sleep, and discover the ember of a dream still glowed in the corner, warmed your bones. It wasn't comfort alone that stirred you, it was possibility, tiny but insistent. You stretched, took that ember into your palm, and carried it outward, into your day's work, into your walking and your weaving and your listening to the wind and thawing hopes. Dreams didn't wait for spring. We dreamt of her, walked toward her, coaxed her into our days. Sometimes I'd dream we were already on the water, the first plank of our new longship cutting through thawing river mists, the hull soaked in syrupy winter sun, and inside that waking daydream, I could smell birch tar and salt, hear the birds returning to thaw-softened trees, feel the ship's motion humming through my bones. When I told my father, he nodded, his eyes distant, and said softly, "We carry her inside, and she carries us onward." Each dream had its place. They were pinned in corners of straw, laid beneath herbs drying from the roof beams, tucked into the pockets of woolen cloaks, like seeds. They existed in waiting. There was a moment, near winter's end, when the youngest child who had spent nights drawing the crocus in soot rushed out of sleep with a shout, pointing at a wallstone where the soot remained faint. "It's awake," she said, voice bright. "It smiles." And we paused, lanterns in hand, and saw the smear of soot shaped vaguely like a petal, a face, a promise. No one needed to explain. We all bent, levelled our breath, and nodded, because in that moment, the longhouse had shared our knowing. Dreams had a presence. They had shape, they had life. Cradles have rhythm. And so did our longhouse. Its floorboards hummed with footsteps. Its roofboards sighed with settling snow. Its beams held tight to the weight of our mind. Music, smell, breath, and dream lived together in every inch of that space. Dreams taught us how to share tomorrow when winter still held us tight. When my mother would dip a cloth into warm milk and pass it to the sick child, she whispered, "Rest now, so you can run tomorrow," as though that whispered promise would stitch strength into the sleeper's bones. When my father carved, when my sister read aloud, when someone passed bread, each act said, "I dream of this next day, and I dream of you meeting it." Such dreaming did not make us foolish. It made us steady. It rooted us in hope, not ignorance. It gave our hands purpose, our voices courage, our bodies a reason to rise with the dawn and gather behind the glow again. Working together, carving, weaving, cooking, we were as much dreaming as we were living. We believed in each other's ability to move the seasons forward. And because we did, the longhouse carried more than bodies, it carried our collective dreams. In that I found my purpose, not to wait for spring, but to invite it, to shape fate with my hands, even when they were cold, to feed flame with small plank, to plant hope in meal. Each evening, I would lay my carving by the hearth, whisper a wish for its journey on waves someday, and feel the house hold it gently, cradle it along with us as the smoke curled upward. Dreams were not invisible. They were seeds and carvings and bowls of broth. They were whispers at dawn and crocus in soot and ember in palm. They were why the longhouse stayed warm, even when the world was frozen. If you've ever kept a promise to yourself in the dark, if you've ever shaped something fragile because you believed in what came next, then you know what it means to cradle tomorrow. First thaw, first step. The moment the ice begins to retreat. You can feel it in the longhouse before you see it. An undercurrent of anticipation stirring in the timber and straw, as though the walls themselves inhale deeply, sensing that the world beyond is changing, thawing, stretching its joints after months of dormancy. And when the door finally creaks open, even just a crack, breath rushes in that tastes of wet earth and promise, carrying with it the sound of dripping water and the song of returning birds. I remember the exact morning it happened, a dawn shimmering faintly pink through snow-clouded sky, and my sister, half asleep, pressed her palm to the door's edge and felt warmth seeping through that thin line, as though spring had reached out a finger to trace the wood grain. She turned to me and whispered, "It's here," and in her voice I heard a tremor of disbelief and wonder, as though the world had taught us how to hope, and then surprised us by listening back. Inside, the fire had gone low only hours before, coals glowing dull red, and overnight the frost had evaporated from the window slats in patterns like delicate lace. Children stirred in the straw, murmuring sleep-heavy names, unaware exactly what had changed, but sensing its arrival in the soft hush that filled the house, a hush deeper than any winter night, because it carried the weight of possibility. We rose slowly, mindful of ritual. No one rushed to the door. We gathered in a ring around the hearth, a ring built over months of sharing breath and smoke and warmth, and I placed a small bowl of spring water at its center, taken earlier from the trickling stream that now ran under thawed ice. And as the sunlight struck its surface, it scattered pinpoints of gold across our faces, igniting something like a glow within us that wasn't heat, but relief and gratitude. Then the door opened fully, with a gentle push, and cold air rushed in once again. But it was different, softer, not the harsh, soaring wind of deep winter, but a crisp, curious breeze that carried tiny droplets of melting snow, landing on our upturned tongues and eyelashes, reminding each of us that existence could bring unexpected renewal. We stepped outside in our wool leggings and boots that had grown damp with weeks of thaw. The yard beyond the longhouse, once uniform white, now rippled with shades of mud and grass, like the memory of earth beneath snow. Our breath, visible and warm, drifted upward, mingling with the exhaled names we whispered. Atho, life, return. I remember kneeling by the doorway, thrusting my hand into the soft mud and feeling a tremor barely perceptible as tiny green shoots poked at the thawing ground. It was not a flower yet, but it was proof, and I whispered a prayer of thanks. though if any guard heard it, they only replied with the slow drip of thawing icicles overhead. Inside, my mother had baked bread yeast finally working in warming air, dough rising as softly as a sigh, and the scent spread into the yard, coaxing birds closer. A robin hopped by the doorstep, pausing to look at us, its red breast bold against the grey-brown of mud. We watched it with quiet awe, as if it were a long-lost friend returned from far away. That day, we spent cleaning the longhouse of winter's residue, sweeping straw, airing blankets, scooping out the soot that had fallen thick. Each sweeping motion was a small ceremony, a farewell to cold, a greeting to light. When the door slammed shut at noon, it was not oppressive but alive, thrummy with possibility, as if saying, "We did this together." We ate our spring meal in soft sunlight bowl of fresh greens. Bread warm, pints of milk freshly drawn and slightly sweet. Each bite tasted more alive than any we'd had in those months of heavy roots and stubborn hunger. Conversation was hopeful. Cows calving soon, barley to plant, new hides to tan, plans woven lightly, like threads into cloth, but strong enough to hold our future. The longhouse felt lighter, rafters taller, straw smelled fresh. Even the smoke, when we lit the evening fire, rose quickly, no longer settling thickly but climbing with ease, finding its path into a sky that had already forgotten winter's weight. At dusk, after gathering at the hearth again, my father produced the small carved ship I'd made back in late winter. He placed it in front of the fire, tilted so the flamelight danced off its curves, and said, simply, "When this touches water, you'll know she's carried spring." And I believed him. We all believed. Then he looked at us, at me, at my sister, at our neighbors, and said, "Tonight, we sleep with open windows. We let the thaw breathe through this place. We trust the spring as we always have." So we did. We laid straw near the door so warmth wouldn't escape. We left the fire low, enough to keep embers but not to close the longhouse to the world. Then we lay down, the first night without closing in the chill, and we listened to the drip of thaw, to the call of returning birds, to the world waking, and we slept with our dreams lighter, our hearts less burdened, our lungs tasting spring. Science tells us that seasons affect mood, behavior, circulation, but the way we welcomed spring had nothing to do with biology. It had to do with ritual and recognition, and letting ourselves feel the thaw inside even while cooling winter still held outside. If tonight you sit beside an open window, your breath mixing with outside air, remember that first step when thaw arrives. Let yourself open to it. Not because winter is over, but because you can begin again while it's still letting go. Brink of new life. As the thaw took firm hold and mornings grew brighter, the longhouse, once quiet except for the murmur of embers, began to pulse with life again. Like an old heart finding fresh rhythm, carrying in its walls and floorboards the rising energy of new beginnings interwoven with every breath, step, and gesture of those who lived within it. Early one morning, I awoke to the sound of low bleats and soft shuffling in the barn adjacent to our longhouse. Rising before first light, I opened the door and stepped into a world still crisp, dew-laden grass pressing against my boots, and there, under a patch of pale sky, stood a pair of newborn twins, their damp wool catching the dawn, halting in their first breaths as though the world beyond had only just begun. My father knelt beside them, his hands gentle but sure as he checked for warmth, eased the afterbirth away, and murmured blessings, notes of gratitude and awe, woven into soft words that the lambs could not hear, but that hung in the hush like music. I realized then that the longhouse was no longer just a shelter. It was a cradle for the smallest of new lives, each birth echoing hope into the rafters and stitching the future shut around us. Inside, the midwife's quiet footsteps echoed along straw-covered floors. She brought the twins into the warm glow, wrapping them in clean wool cloths, freshly rinsed in melted snow and warmed by the embers. My sister, standing beside her, drifted between lamplight and warmth, clutching the linen that would become their first swaddling. I could feel the soft press of her breath as she leaned close to watch their chests rise, knowing that life was fragile, wondrous, and entirely our responsibility. A hush settled around us as we cared for these new souls feeding, talking to them in soft, lullaby tones drawn from harvest songs, humming the nursery chants of our ancestors, each note meant to knit them to the longhouse as surely as blood ever could. We passed them from arm to arm, shifting between midwife, mother, sister, and father, each touch offering reassurance, warmth, care, belonging. Soon, the rest of the longhouse stirred with gentle purpose. We moved with renewed tenderness, each step a promise that these lambs would grow, that the barley we planted in thawed furrows would rise, that our laughter would still echo amid farm days and candlelit evenings. Our hands, once worn by winter's demands, became instruments of care washing, feeding, stroking, cleaning, each act part of a choreography meant to weave new life into our place. The longhouse, too, seemed to respond. The walls expanded, the smoke hole lifted slightly with fresh air, the straw smelled newly harvested, and the beams creaked, not from snowfall but from warmth and weight families gathering. Animals close, purpose restored. The hearth became a center of celebration. Not just survival, its flame leapt higher, fueled by brothers carrying fresh wood rather than desperation. I remember kneeling beside the twins as sunlight finally broke fully across a window opening, casting long slashes across the floorboards and illuminating every tiny flake of dust floating in the gentle morning. In that light, I saw possibilities, futures unbroken, wounds softened, seasons turning again. I pressed my fingers to the twins' wool, felt their weak beats, and realized these moments were woven from the same threads as our hard-won winter resilience, community, and humble faith. Each day, more births followed. Lambs, calves, chicks, even a kid goat born under a slanted beam, deeply sighing into existence. And with every entrance into this world, the longhouse echoed with new names, quiet, unassuming, yet carrying weight and promise. Food grew richer, first greens from emerging shoots, cream from well-fed goats, eggs warmed by cautious hens returning to nest. Conversations shifted from memories of winter to plans for planting, for landmarks painted in green rather than white. Our hearts swelled quietly. We carried hope in our gloves and overalls, in the mud caked to boots, in the songs hummed while we worked. We planted seeds as blessings, told stories as reassurance, and welcomed new life as the purest form of resistance to the season's dark. I helped spread straw for the newborn lambs, kneeling in the soft bedding and pressing each stalk into place, like laying the foundation of dreams. My hands, roughened by winter woodwork, moved with precision and tenderness. Each straw placed was a stroke in a painting depicting life continuing. My sister brought fresh water in a carved wooden bowl, balancing it in her hands with such care that I saw grown women learn humility. My father moved among us, adjusting blankets, directing laughter toward anxious mothers, singing softly of fields that would soon turn gold. That night, around the hearth, we shared a meal of boiled greens and barley broth, simmered with the first herbs sprouted by the thaw we carried inside. We toasted to the twins, the lambs, the calves, the future voices soft, calm, reverent. We told the story of how we waited through cold, how we carried light and dreams and song, and how now life was showing up in flesh and fur and feather, because we kept the fire and our hearts open. Even the goats huddled near, ears twitching, sensing that the longhouse was more alive than it had been in months. They seemed to lean in closer, braying low, as though offering their own welcome. I fell asleep that night to the gentle bleat of lambs, the crackle of embers, and the murmur of our family dreaming. And I thought, this is what winter was for not to end, but to prepare us to strip away ease and leave only essential hope, so that now, on the brink of new life, we stand ready to nurture it, fiercely and gently. Science might call it seasonal cycles of life, but to us, it was a promise kept, a testament that the bond between human and land, between birth and community, holds fast even when the world sleeps. If tonight you cradle new life, a plant sprouting on your windowsill, a plan stirring in your mind, a promise unfolding, then you stand on the brink of new life. Cherish it, tend it with the care we gave those lambs, for each fresh beginning carries our collective heartbeat, bearing each other. After winter's long trial, we discovered that bearing each other the act of leaning in when another struggled, of sharing burdens as though they were our own, became more essential than any physical shelter, because survival ceased to be just about food or warmth or medicine. It became about the willingness to carry someone else's load when the world felt too heavy for them alone. And in doing so, carrying our own burdens a little less alone too. In the days after the births, the air inside our longhouse carried a new weight not of fear or cold, but of shared responsibility, threaded through laughter, hushed concern, and hands that moved faster than words. I watched my mother kneel beside the midwife as she tended a woman who'd fallen ill despite spring's approach, settling a warm compress of herbs on her brow and whispering reassurance. Even as her own eyes showed fatigue, my sister leaned in to hold the woman's hand, tracing the veins beneath cold skin. And without saying a thing, they gave her hope. That moment taught me that bearing someone is not an act of heroism. It's a breath, an offer, a recognition that we are each other's reason to stand. Below, in the barn, a young calf had fallen through mud softened by thaw, and my father, strong from carving and labour, lifted it gently into dry straw, rubbing it with clean rags and warm soup poured from the hearth's pot so the calf would rise again. He did not roar. He did not demand it set upon its hooves. He simply held space, feeding warmth until life returned. In the kitchen, firelight danced on steam that rose from fresh broth, and we saw the old cook, bent at the waist, her arms shaking as she stirred, and my sister set her own bowl down, came to her side, and guided the ladle with hers, sharing the motion so the bowl would stir again. And without fanfare, without fuss, they bore the burden together. Strength met fragility at every corner. A child cried because the hay had hidden a thorn. Friends carried the frightened one on shoulders. An elder's eye misted at the sight of newborn lambs, that same elder guided by a younger hand to witness new life. A warrior returned with a wound in his leg, and the son of a farmer bound it with cloth and balm, steadying the man's breath. Inside those walls, bearing each other was a shared vow, unspoken but more binding than any oath. You were not alone. Your pain was shared. Your relief would find voice in another's exhale. We built mental bridges when physical ones could not span the weight of someone's sorrow. I recall one evening when grief unexpectedly stormed our warmth. A neighbour's house had burned from a stray spark. The man, stunned, arrived barefoot, clutching soot-flecked tools, face drawn and distant. We paused. Embers paused. Then in one motion, my father pressed a blanket into his arms. My mother brought bread. I offered water. We bore him in that moment, not as stranger, but as brother, knuckled by winter's harshness. And when he spoke at last, his tear glinting, we all exhaled, because shelter against cold is important, but shelter against grief is what builds families. Beneath smoke-stained rafters, strength and fragility danced together. When laughter erupted over spilled soup, we laughed. When sorrow dropped over someone's shoulder, we sighed together. Song rose up when the longhouse tilled hope. Silence settled when loss fell. We carried each other in turns. It was a daily ritual, not an event. I learnt the geometry of bearing, shoulder to lean on, hand to brace, scarf to warm, loaf to break. I learned that to bear someone's burden didn't require speaking. It required noticing, a look, a gesture, a bowl, a shingle to fix the roof. It required presence. For my part, I bore my own burdens in seeing and offering and leaning. I learned to say, sit here, let me hold that, even when I had nothing to give but time. And in giving someone time, I found time gifted back in kindness, in shared silence, in quiet gratitude. Those moments stitched us into kin, not by blood but by bearing. In the coming weeks, threats came. Storms bruised the fields. Spring rains washed out paths. Some livestock fell ill, but we met each with bearing. We huddled under rough tarps to mend barns, cared for ill animals together, carried stones for water troughs, each person taking a turn until the work was done, voices soft but unwavering. Night times brought reflection around the hearth, and sometimes a question, who carried you today? And sometimes imperfect answers, I didn't know I could, to which someone would reply, let that be enough. Now let me carry you tomorrow. In those exchanges, bearing became a promise to both ask and answer. a rhythm of support that held us like breath holds fire. It weaved into our culture, our rhythm, our inner music. One day, I stood outside the doorway and watched as a traveler paused, noticing our yard bursting with green and life. He watched the smoke rise, heard laughter inside, felt our rhythm, and he asked, "How do you stand here so strong?" My father replied, "Not with boast, but with truth. We carry each other." The traveler stayed. He worked. He became our neighbor, because bearing echoes outward, others hear it, join it, learn it. It becomes the hearthlight that draws weary hearts home. Science may say empathy rewires brains, but in our longhouse, it rewired our souls so that bearing became instinct, not choice. If tonight you feel the weight of someone else's worry, an anxious friend, an aging parent, a lost colleague, know that to bear them is to shine fire into their darkness. Even one small gesture, a text, a bowl, a walk carries more warmth than you know, opening to the world. After months spent cradled in winter's hush, after carrying each other through births, losses, laughter, and thaw, our longhouse, once an inward-turned refuge, opened in a way that felt like emerging from an island into vast blue sea, not just physically, but in heart and mind as we began to look beyond its timbered walls, ready to rejoin the world, changed and stronger for the warmth we had cultivated inside. I still feel the moment in my bones, a mid-morning, when the smoke curled lazily toward the open smoke hole, and the barn doors stood wide enough for breeze and curiosity to slip in. A group of travelers' merchants bundled in patched cloaks arrived on a muddy track. Drawn by smoke and laughter, they paused at our threshold, gazing up at our longhouse's sturdy frame, the living tapestry of moss and fresh straw woven into roof and wall. And I sensed our readiness before they spoke. My father stepped forward, hands open, shoulders squared with a warmth that came not just from companionship, but from conviction. We could extend our hearth to others without fear. He welcomed them, his voice calm but rich. "Come in, warm yourselves. You arrived just in time for soup and new bread." There was no pride in his words, just an offer, an invitation, a signal that the longhouse was no longer a closed circle, but a circle ready to expand. We led them inside, drying their boots by the fire, offering mugs of broth that steamed like morning mist. And as they approached, I noticed the travelers' shoulders drop, finally safe, finally seen, finally part of something bigger. They passed through straw-strewn thresholds into the shadows warmed by flame, and I watched each one exhale in relief, their bodies uncurling from travel's tension. And with each breath, our world grew wider. Inside, children peeked from behind barrels. Wide-eyed, my sister brought out fresh bread, broken into chunks and offered generously. My mother ladled soup carefully, stirring in greens and herbs. My uncle hummed a welcome tune, low and steady, that built into a chorus when the travelers invited joined in, their voices slightly rough, shaped by distant paths, fused with ours. The house vibrated lightly, a resonance born from joining. It was a new kind of warmth. Outside the barn, the travelers' goods, textiles, metal tools, dried fruits were laid on blankets. And though trade was a familiar idea, here it felt sacred, as though we were extending not just hospitality, but trust. I helped tie a bundle of oats traded for a bolt of cloth, watching the merchant's eyes gleam with appreciation. It occurred to me that our home was no longer just ours. It was part of a network of hands and stories stretching beyond the horizon. Later, around the hearth, we shared stories, mine of winter's hush, theirs of markets and distant seasons, of towns where smoke hung heavy in towers, of sea voyages past shorelines we had only dreamed of. We listened, rapt, as their words pulled our minds outward, even as the hearth held us steady. And in weaving our winter stories with theirs, we realized the world was vast, yet welcoming, like a tapestry we were all stitching together. Shared laughter rose again, not just at spilled soup or goats slipping in mud, but at tales of caravans lost and found, of markets closing at twilight, of laughter echoing in taverns in places we'd only glimpsed in daydreams. We swapped jokes, ours softer, theirs honed by travel, and the longhouse became a forum of connection, where walls meant warmth, not separation. At dusk, One traveler, a woman with travel-stained cloak, produced a fluted wooden flute. She brought it low to her lips and began to play a melody both distant and familiar, notes rising among embers and creating a bridge between our worlds. My father lifted his mug. I pressed my palm to the flute's worn wood. Children fell silent, and for a moment, I thought the flame in the hearth dimmed just to listen better. And when the song ended, the silence held itself gentle, respectful before applause that felt like a pulse, a heartbeat of unity. In that night, we learned that hospitality wasn't a passive welcome. It was an act of opening hearts, opening minds, opening possibilities. The longhouse no longer carried our small world, only it carried others' dreams, too. The next morning, travelers departed, leaving behind grains and cloth and gratitude. We stood at the threshold, shoulder to shoulder, watching them disappear down the road, the mist drifting across their cloaks, and I felt a hollow swell, a glimpse of loss mixed with pride, knowing we had created ripples beyond our walls. My father placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "This is how we carry spring outward." I understood then that our journey, winter survival, was incomplete without reaching beyond. We bore each other inside, and now we bore others in kindness. From that day on, the longhouse held traces of the world beyond. A fragment of brightly dyed cloth pinned to the wall, a small carved bead that rolled across the board table, a seed from a distant land tucked between beams. Each artifact carried a story, a line on our map of connection. Each night's silence hummed with echoes of unknown places. The world, our wider community, responded. Neighbors from other farms passed through, sometimes swapping bits of news, sometimes song, and our hearth expanded again to hold them. We became a hub for spring's exchange, not just in goods, but in empathy, stories, companionship. Science speaks of social cohesion, that shared experiences bind communities physically and mentally. But in our longhouse, cohesion was warmth. You could see it in joined smiles, hear it in flute songs, taste it in shared stew, feel it in open doors. If tonight you share space with someone different, new faces, new stories, remember that opening matters, that small kindness becomes heritage. That when we open our hearth, we carry spring outward into the world, the candle still flickering. When you've lived through winter's hush, carried light in darkness, borne others' burdens, welcomed spring's first steps, and opened your home to the wider world, you come to understand that endings aren't final. They're another way for the hearth to whisper, "I am still here." And in that understanding, the longhouse, our stories, our lives all converge into this moment, a quiet candle still flickering amid embers, reminding us that this too is beginning. It was just before dusk, after travelers had gone, animals huddled in warm stalls, and the fire had been banked low enough to sleep safely, just enough ember left to spark morning's flame. We gathered in our worn places, hands across laps, knees near straw, breathing soft and rhythmic, waiting not for words, but for presence. The air smelled of smoked wood, fresh bread crumbs on the table, and the lingering sweetness of spring water used for tea. It was a tapestry of senses woven from months of shared seasons. I looked around at familiar faces, my mother's lined eyes, my sister's gentle curve of a smile, the midwife's calm posture, my uncle's weathered hands, and I realized each of them carried echoes of every part of our journey. The longhouse had changed us. Winter had tempered our resilience. Spring had opened our hope. Lives had been born, and each act of kindness left a glow. In the center of our circle sat a single candle in a shallow clay bowl, its flame flickering with breath, casting dancing patterns on the walls. It was not new. It had burned through diets of seal oil, tallow, and wax collected over time, and tonight it held steady, though a breeze from the open door teased it with faint flickers. That candle was our heart. It burned because we fed it not just with wax, but with care, ritual, presence. My father rose and spoke quietly, his voice steady enough that each word filled the hush like soft snow landing. This candle is not just light, it's memory, it's loss, it's promise. It is you and me and everyone we carried through this season. When it dims, remember how we kept it alive. He asked us to gently breathe toward the flame it danced, to fold our hands in appreciation, it glowed, to whisper a word that gave it reason to stand inside our darkness. Softly, one by one, we spoke. Hope, thank you. Remember, here. Together, light. When it was my turn, I pressed my palm to my chest and whispered, may this light find its way into every house, every heart, every night. As I said it, the candle steadied. As if hearing me, then we passed the candle, bowl in hand. Around the circle, each person tipped it like sharing a heartbeat. We watched the flame wander from neighbor to neighbor, alive in reflection, alive in ritual, alive in shared breath. Without instruction, we began humming that winter melody again, soft, intimate, familiar, because song isn't reserved for firelight alone. It's what we become in the glow. Around that candle, we hummed, we breathed, we remembered every season we'd lived through, how darkness came, how breath carried light back, how dreams were cradled, how newcomers were welcomed, how births and deaths shaped us. I noticed tears in my mother's eyes, not sorrowful, but full of acknowledgement that life carried on, and that we carried with it. My sister smiled through hers. My uncle's stoic face softened. The candle reflected each emotion, dancing like a child's laughter or a mother's lullaby. Its flame was fragile, yet resolute just like us. We closed the evening with the shortest prayer I've ever heard, but richest in meaning. Let it burn until dawn. Then, in silence, we stood and slipped out one by one, leaving the candle alone in its bowl. Its flame flickered softly in the echo of our departure, but it did not falter. I stayed just a moment longer, drawing a final breath in that quiet room, listening to wood creak, straw settle, embers sigh. I felt the weight of seasons settle into my chest like an old friend. I walked out into night, the chill pressing gently against my cloak, and I looked back through the open doorway, the longhouse glowing warm inside, candle flames steady, breath visible in the cold. I exhaled. I felt small and part of something immense. I felt hope leak from my chest outward, because the candle burned, and I understood that the flame would reach beyond those walls, that it would accompany travelers and neighbors. That memory, ritual, these were our inheritance and our gift. When I awoke the next morning, embers still warm, candle stub remnant flickering at first light, I relit it from the hearth fire, and its warmth returned, steady and familiar. It sat by the window, its light blending with dawn. I placed my hand beside it, palm open to warmth, and I felt the seasons within me: winter's resilience, spring's renewal, community's opening, love's bond all settle softly, like petals, into my bones. If tonight you light a candle or turn on a lamp, do it with intention. Say a word, breathe softly. Let the flame stand as witness to your journey. Remember how far you've come, who you carried, who carried you, what seasons shaped you, what doors you opened, what lives you welcomed. The candle will burn low again. It always does. But as long as we remember how to rekindle, how to gather, how to bear, then every ending becomes a new beginning. And the flicker, it reminds us that warmth, like hope, like love, once kindled, never truly dies. And now, dear friend, as our story comes to a gentle close, with the fire dimming and the voices quieting to a hum, I want to thank you truly for walking with me through this long, slow tale. You didn't just listen to a story, you kept someone's memory alive. You brought warmth to a longhouse that stood through the frost of centuries. So thank you for your time, your heart, your company. If this story meant something to you, if even one moment stayed in your chest like the echo of a fire's last crackle, I'd be grateful if you let me know. Leave a candle emoji below, or share where you were listening from. Porch, bedroom, quiet walk. Your presence matters more than you know. And if you'd like to be part of more journeys like this, I warmly invite you to subscribe to the channel. No pressure, just an open door. You'll find more stories waiting slow, true, and meant to comfort. Maybe next time, we'll follow the footprints of a forgotten sailor, or sit beside a woman who waited every night at her cabin window. Long after the war ended, there's always another ember, another letter, another whisper from the past, and I'll be here, by the fire, waiting to tell it. So until we meet again, keep your heart warm, your light steady, and may sleep come to you gently tonight. Leave it if this story kept you company tonight. Did someone like Elira ever live quietly in your life too? Share below. Subscribe for more slow stories from history's quiet corners.